In the ancient mountains of Tibet, where the wind whispers through the pines and clouds brush against snow-capped peaks, there lies a monastery renowned for its teachings on silence. In this sacred place, a young disciple sought to understand the mysteries of the mind and spirit. His heart was filled with questions, but one in particular consumed him. When should we remain silent? His master, noticing the restlessness in his eyes, decided it was time for a profound lesson. On an autumn morning, as golden leaves danced in the air, the master called the disciple for a special task. "Today," the master said, "you will carry this bucket of water to the top of the mountain. The journey will be long, and many challenges will arise. Remember, the water in the bucket is like your mind. The more agitated it is, the less it reflects the sky." The disciple took the old wooden bucket, heavy with crystal clear water from the sacred stream. As he began his journey, the sun was just starting to rise, painting the horizon in shades of pink and orange. The weight in his arms was significant, but his spirit felt light with the anticipation of learning. In the first stretch of the path, he encountered a group of young monks who began to tease him. They nudged his shoulder, causing the water to sway dangerously. "Look who it is," they said mockingly. "The disciple who never knows when to keep quiet." Their words were like poisoned arrows, targeting old insecurities. The urge to respond burned in his throat. Words of defense and anger tingled on his tongue, ready to burst forth. But then, he looked at the water in the bucket. The more he reacted inwardly, the more it stirred, losing its natural clarity. The monks continued their taunts, now throwing small stones into the water, creating ripples that threatened to overflow. The disciple felt his breathing quicken, his face heat up. Years of meditation training seemed to melt away under the rising flame of anger. But something extraordinary began to happen. The longer he held his silence, the more he observed his own anger as though he were a bystander. He saw how each provocation was like a wave on the water's surface, disruptive at first, but eventually fading into stillness. Hours passed and the sun climbed higher into the sky. The heat intensified the challenge, with beads of sweat streaming down his face. The monks, realizing their words couldn't pierce the disciple's shield of silence, escalated their mockery. They mimicked him now, laughing at his past failures and dredging up moments of shame he wished to forget. Yet, in his silence, the disciple discovered a strength he never knew he possessed. He realized that every moment he chose not to respond was a small victory over his ego. Silence wasn't suppression, it was liberation. As he continued his ascent, he noticed that the water in the bucket had grown calmer despite the constant movement. It perfectly reflected the blue sky above, even as the provocations persisted. It was as if the water had found its peace amidst the chaos, just as his mind had found clarity in the silence. The monks, exhausted by their futile efforts, eventually left, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the weight of the bucket. At that moment, he understood that the true power of silence in the face of anger wasn't merely in holding back words, but in transforming the energy of anger into something deeper, a quiet understanding of oneself. When he reached a higher clearing on the mountain, the disciple paused for a moment. The water in the bucket, now perfectly still, reflected not just the sky, but also his own face. In that reflection, he saw something new, a look of serenity that hadn't been there when he began his journey. In that same clearing, while gazing at his reflection in the water, the disciple noticed the presence of an old sage seated beneath an ancient cherry tree. The sage seemed as still as the mountains themselves, his eyes half closed in deep contemplation. The disciple's first impulse was to approach with his countless questions. After all, wasn't that what it meant to learn? The water in the bucket still reflected the sky as the disciple sat close to the sage. He opened his mouth to ask his first question, but something stopped him. There was a quality to the sage's silence that seemed more eloquent than any words could ever be. The sun was now high in the sky, and drops of dew still clung to the cherry tree's leaves. The sage, with deliberately slow movements, reached out with his wrinkled hands to collect these drops in a small ceramic bowl. Each motion was a silent dance, a ritual that seemed to contain all the knowledge of the universe. The disciple watched as each drop fell into the bowl with an almost imperceptible sound. He began to feel his questions dissolve, like mist under the morning sun. In the silence, his senses sharpened. He noticed how the wind subtly shifted direction before each drop fell, how the light played differently on each one. Hours passed, and the disciple remained in complete silence. His body began to learn a new language, the language of deep observation. He noticed how the sage made minute adjustments to his posture to reach different leaves, how his fingers trembled slightly with age, yet maintained extraordinary precision. Each movement held lessons that no words could adequately convey. At one point, a leaf fell into the water in his bucket. Instead of removing it immediately, the disciple observed how it floated, creating small ripples that extended to the bucket's edges. In that moment, he understood that true learning lay not in the answers he sought, but in the ability to observe each moment deeply. The sage continued his meticulous work, now arranging the collected drops into specific patterns within the bowl. His movements were like silent writing, telling a story that could only be understood through attentive observation. The disciple realized that every question he had brought carried an expectation of an immediate answer, a search for quick satisfaction that now seemed shallow. When a stronger breeze shook the branches of the cherry tree, several drops fell at once. The sage did not attempt to catch them all. He simply watched some fall to the ground while collecting others with the same unhurried precision. In that moment, the disciple grasped another lesson. Not all knowledge needs to be captured. Some lessons are learned precisely by letting them pass. The silence between them had transformed into something alive, vibrant, and full of meaning. It was as if the air itself had become a teacher, imparting wisdom through the dance of leaves, the movement of clouds, the rhythm of breathing. The disciple realized that his earlier questions had arisen from mental noise, from a need to fill spaces that perhaps were meant to remain empty. As the light of day began to shift, signaling the approach of evening, the disciple noticed how his body had naturally adapted to the stillness. His breathing had synchronized with the sage's. His movements had become more deliberate, more mindful. Knowledge was not flowing through words, but through this silent attunement to the present moment. The water in his bucket, which once reflected only the sky, now seemed to reflect something deeper, perhaps the very essence of true learning. The disciple understood that silence was not merely the absence of words, but a state of complete receptivity, where each moment became a teacher and every observation a lesson. The sun was beginning its descent when the sound of crying broke the mountain stillness. A family from a nearby village appeared along the steep path, carrying a small child in their arms. The disciple watched as the sage remained motionless, only his eyes moving softly in the direction of the newcomers. The mother, tears streaming down her dust-covered face, approached the sage. In her arms, the child burned with fever, her small body trembling like a leaf in the wind. The father, his eyes bearing the weight of despair, knelt on the hardened earth. "Great sage," the mother sobbed, "we have tried every remedy in the village. The healers cannot help. Our daughter, she grows weaker with each passing hour. Please, tell us what to do. Please, save our only child." The sage did not respond. His eyes, deep as ancient lakes, took in the scene with a compassion that transcended words. The disciple felt a tightening in his chest and an almost uncontrollable urge to speak, to offer comfort, to fill the silence that seemed as heavy as the bucket of water in his arms. The child coughed, a fragile sound that echoed through the clearing. Drops of dew continued to fall into the sage's bowl, each marking the seconds of that suspended moment. The father began recounting, His voice choked. All the remedies they had tried, all the prayers they had offered, all the temples they had visited. The sage's silence persisted, but it was not empty. It was a silence that held every word of pain, every tear shed, every anguished sigh. The disciple realized that sometimes suffering does not need answers. It needs space to exist, to be acknowledged in its entirety. The mother, exhausted, sat on the ground, still cradling her daughter. Her crying had softened into a gentle lament, almost melodic. The sage continued his ritual of collecting dew, but now his movements seemed to follow the rhythm of the mother's lament. It was as if his silence was dancing with the family's grief. In that moment, the disciple understood something profound about silence in the face of suffering. He saw how words, no matter how well-intentioned, could fall short before the vastness of human pain. The sage's silence was not a refusal to help, it was help itself. The water in his bucket now reflected the lengthening shadows of late afternoon, mingled with the faint image of the sick child's face. The disciple observed how suffering, like water, had its own fluid nature. It could not be contained by words, nor resolved with hasty advice. As time passed, something subtle began to shift in the clearing. The mother's crying quieted, not because her pain had lessened, but because the sage's compassionate silence had created a space where she could breathe more freely. The father, who had spoken frantically before, found moments of pause between his words. The child, still 5-ish, seemed calmer. Her trembling had eased, cradled by the shared silence. The disciple noticed a kind of healing in the mere act of being fully present, completely present, without trying to alter or fix the moment. The shadows stretched further, and the air grew colder. The family's suffering remained, but it had transformed in some way. It was as if the sage's silence had allowed their pain to find its own path, its own rhythm of expression. The disciple then understood that silence in the face of suffering is not an absence, it is a deeply active presence. It is an act of courage to remain present without attempting to fill the void with superficial words of comfort. It is a form of respect for the sacred journey each being takes through their own pain. As the family lingered in the clearing, a familiar figure emerged from the mountain path. It was the merchant from the valley, known both for his wealth and his questionable practices. His arms were laden with luxurious offerings, rare incense, fine silks, and exotic fruits. The disciple recognized him immediately. This was the same man who, according to valley rumors, had deceived many poor families, seizing their lands through dishonest contracts. The merchant approached the sage with deliberate steps, his expensive garments dragging along the dirt path. The contrast between him and the suffering family was stark. While some sought salvation, another seemed to seek absolution. The disciple felt his chest tighten with judgments threatening to overflow, like the water brimming in his bucket. With grand gestures, the merchant began laying his offerings before the sage. Every movement seemed calculated to draw attention, to impress. The disciple watched as the merchant's hands, though adorned with jeweled rings, trembled slightly as he arranged his gifts. There was something in his eyes, a glimmer of desperation poorly masked by his ostentation. "Venerable one," the merchant said, his voice wavering between arrogance and supplication, "I bring the finest offerings from distant lands. Surely they are worthy of your blessing." His words hung in the air like incense smoke, but they carried the weight of untold stories. The sage maintained the same silence he had offered the suffering family. His eyes regarded the merchant with the same impartial compassion, showing neither approval nor condemnation. The disciple realized that his own body had tensed, his hands gripping the bucket of water more tightly, as if holding not just water, but all of his judgments as well. As the merchant continued his elaborate ritual of offerings, the disciple noticed something surprising. In the water of the bucket, the reflection of the merchant did not show his fine clothes or imposing posture. It revealed only a man, as vulnerable and human as the family beside him. The ripples in the water seemed to dissolve layers of appearance, exposing a deeper truth. The sage's silence began to work its subtle magic. Without words of acceptance or rejection, he created a space where judgments lost their power. The disciple watched as the merchant gradually let go of his mask of superiority. His movements became less theatrical, more genuine. In a particularly poignant moment, the merchant looked at the sick child in the mother's arms. Something in his expression shifted, a shadow of recognition, perhaps of regret. His hands, once busy arranging offerings, now rested quietly in his lap. The disciple then understood that silence in the face of judgment was not a form of complicity with wrongdoing, nor a denial of justice. It was an acknowledgement of the complexity of human nature. In the sage's silence, the family's suffering and the merchant's search for redemption could coexist. The late afternoon light painted elongated shadows in the clearing, softening the contours of everyone present. The disciple noticed that his own judgments, so firm and clear moments ago, began to dissolve like mist under the sun. The water in his bucket now reflected a different picture, not a separation of right and wrong, rich and poor, but an interconnected web of human stories. The merchant, perhaps for the first time in a long while, allowed himself to simply be present, without trying to prove his worth through offerings or words. The silence had created a mirror where he could see beyond his own mask. His hands, once restless, now rested peacefully, and his breathing had found a natural rhythm. In that moment, the disciple understood that the true power of silence in judgment lies in its ability to create a space where transformation can happen naturally. Without condemnation, without premature absolution. Just the conscious presence that allows each being to find their own path to truth. The shadows of twilight began to dance among the trees as the sage finally moved. With a gentle gesture, he invited everyone, the distressed family, the restless merchant, and the disciple with his bucket to sit in a circle. The mountain air had cooled, bringing with it a stillness unlike any the disciple had experienced throughout the day. The sage closed his eyes, and as if following an ancient, invisible choreography, everyone else did the same. The disciple carefully placed his bucket of water in front of him, noticing that its surface was calmer than it had been all day, as though it too were preparing for a sacred moment. In the darkness behind his closed eyelids, the disciple began to perceive the sounds of the mountain with extraordinary clarity. The soft cries of the sick child had transformed into rhythmic breathing. The mother's restrained sobs created a kind of natural metronome. Even the merchant's heavy breathing blended into the silent symphony of the moment. As the minutes unfolded, something extraordinary began to happen. The disciple realized he could no longer distinguish his own breath from the breaths of others. It was as though the circle of people had merged into a single organism, pulsing in harmony with the rhythm of the mountain. In the silence of meditation, the individual stories that had filled the day, the anger from earlier provocations, the silent lessons of the morning dew, the family suffering, the merchant's quest for redemption, all seemed to dissolve into something greater. It was as if the silence had become a vast ocean where all experiences floated like small waves on its surface. The disciple felt his body relax in a way he had never experienced before. Every muscle that had tensed during the climb up the mountain, every emotional contraction from the day's events, all melted away in the embrace of meditative silence. It was as if the air itself had become a healing balm. At one point, a gentle breeze passed through the clearing, causing the leaves to whisper. The disciple realized he could feel this sound not just with his ears, but with his entire being. It was as though every cell in his body had become an instrument of listening, attuned to the subtlest frequencies of silence. In the shared darkness of meditation, the differences between the people in the circle seemed to fade away. There was no longer merchant or farmer, sage or disciple, only human beings breathing together under the twilight sky. The family's suffering and the merchant's restlessness had not disappeared, but they had found a larger space in which to exist. The disciple realized that this meditative silence was unlike any he had experienced throughout the day. It was not a silence of restraint, as when he faced anger. It was not a silence of observation, as he had learned from the dew. It was not a silence of compassion, as in the face of suffering, nor a silence of non-judgment, as with the merchant. It was a silence that encompassed all those silences and transcended them. The water in his bucket, now illuminated by the first starlight, was perfectly still. It had become like a dark mirror, reflecting not only the sky above, but also the depth of the silence that enveloped them. The disciple understood that, just as the water had found its natural stillness, his mind too was discovering its true nature in the silence of meditation. Time seemed to lose its usual meaning. Minutes or hours could have passed in the space of meditative silence. Such measures became irrelevant. What mattered was the quality of presence that unfolded, the depth of peace that settled over the circle of practitioners. When the sage finally struck a small bell, signaling the end of the meditation, the sound reverberated through the bodies of those present like a wave of light. The disciple opened his eyes to find a transformed world. The clearing, now bathed in the soft glow of the first stars, seemed to vibrate with a tangible sacredness. The first moonbeam touched the clearing, illuminating the circle of people who were slowly opening their eyes after the meditation. The disciple noticed how everyone seemed different now. The family, still concerned about their daughter, bore a new serenity on their faces. The merchant had shed his defensive posture, and he himself felt profoundly transformed. It was then that the sage spoke for the first time that day. His voice was as gentle as the night breeze, yet carried the weight of ancient wisdom. The silence you experience today is not emptiness. It is the source of all true understanding. Turning to the disciple, he continued, "You began this day by asking when we should remain silent. Now you carry the answer not just in your mind, but in every drop of water in this bucket." The disciple looked at the water, now reflecting the full moon. On its mirrored surface, he saw all the moments of the day, the silence that tamed his anger during the provocations, the silence that taught him to observe and learn, the silence that offered compassion to others suffering, the silence that suspended judgment, and the deep silence of meditation that united everyone in a shared experience of peace. Silence, the sage said, is the language of the universe. When we allow ourselves to immerse in its mystery, we discover that it speaks louder than all words. In anger, it teaches us self-control. In learning, it shows that true wisdom lies beyond words. In the face of suffering, it offers comfort no words could provide. In judgment, it reminds us of our shared humanity. And in meditation, it reveals our true nature. The sick child had fallen asleep in her mother's arms, her face serene under the moonlight. The merchant silently gathered his offerings and, with a humble gesture, handed them to the family. The disciple realized that silence had achieved what no sermon could. It had transformed each person present through their own internal experience. The sage concluded, "Silence is not merely the absence of sound, it is the presence of infinite wisdom. When we learn to inhabit it consciously, it becomes our greatest teacher." That night, descending the mountain under the moonlight, the disciple carried not just a bucket of water, but a profound understanding that would change his life forever. The water in his bucket, now as calm as the moon reflected within it, stood as a living testament to the transformative power of silence. The message was clear. Silence is a living force that teaches us life's deepest lessons. In anger, it shows us the path to peace. In learning, it reveals wisdom beyond words. In suffering, it offers the comfort of conscious presence. In judgment, it unveils our shared humanity. In meditation, It connects us to our true nature. And in all these moments, silence is not an escape from the world, but a deeper way of connecting with it and with our own divine essence.